Besides intracellular organelles, adopting passengers with special metabolic capabilities, and a few other variations such as the cytoskeleton, some eukaryotes have come up with another innovation that organisms like us find especially important. That's multicellularity. There is a series of protists within one particular group that show this lovely progression from these single-celled organisms here to organisms in the genus Gonium that tend to live together in these groups of a dozen or so, to still other protists that live in much tighter and more coordinated groups, until finally you come to this organism, Volvox, where certain cells play one role and certain cells play a completely different role. There are cells within a Volvox colony that are devoted entirely to reproduction. And this, where you've got different cells within a group that have different specific roles, that's considered the minimum threshold for multicellularity. Of course, if you keep going and cells continue to become more specialized in their roles, and they become more tightly coordinated, pretty soon you can have a very large and functionally very complicated multicellular organism. And that appears to be what has happened multiple times within the eukaryotes. The plants, the fungi, the animals, these are the most well-known multicellular groups. But there are actually several other different cases within the protists where multicellularity has evolved. One of the ones that we'll be looking at later is the case of the choanoflagellates. These are single choanoflagellates. These are single-celled protists that make a living filtering food out of the water. What happens is when they thrash their flagella, which are shown here, particles get trapped in these microvilli. They're passed through this sort of collar of filaments. The cell then ingests that food, and that's how it makes its living. If you put a lot of choanoflagellates together in a sort of a single sheet and fold that sheet around so it forms a tube around a central chamber, it looks an awful lot like a sponge. And sponges are the basal group of organisms at the base of the metazoa, the animal kingdom. So there's a list of innovations that you see within the protists. Other than that, it is kind of difficult to get a handle on the sheer variety of protists because they do things in a lot of different ways. Here are a few themes that you ought to be aware of when it comes to protists. Some of them have rigid internal structures for support. So for example, this is a heliozoan. It has a skeleton that is made of silicon. Others have structures on the outside of their bodies that serve the same purpose. These can be made of calcium carbonate in the case of the foraminiferans. They can be made of silicon again in the case of the diatoms. Green algae are covered with plates made of cellulose. These sort of structures have evolved many times. They not only provide protection, but they provide some kind of support for the shape of a cell. However, there are some cells that don't have a shape. So for example, the amoeba. And this is one of its strengths because one of the forms of locomotion in protists is the ability to crawl. The movement of an amoeba is a fascinating thing. It uses its cytoskeleton to constantly remodel itself. And it's able to accomplish what's called cell crawling in this way. A number of other protists use flagella or cilia. These are similar structures, although I'd like to point out that the flagellum that you see among protists is nothing like the flagellum that you see in bacteria. They look very similar, they function in similar ways, but that's convergent evolution. The details, when you look at them closely, are quite different. Feeding in the protists also varies dramatically from one group to another. Some organisms among this group use ingestive feeding. Again, The remarkable adaptability of shape of the amoebas allow them to flow around and ingest food. But there are also organisms that have gullets that they basically they use to draw food particles in and digest them intracellularly. Here's a series of pictures representing how an amoeba flows around and engulfs its food. It's worth watching if you ever get a chance to see one under the microscope. There also are organisms that, rather than ingesting food, simply absorb it. These are protists that live within a high concentration of food. Perhaps the most famous or maybe infamous is Plasmodium, the malarial parasite. It will sit inside your red blood cells and absorb food from them. That's one of the ways that it harms your body and often harms people's bodies fatally. Many of the absorptive feeding protists are less harmful than this. A lot of them are decomposers. So they're sitting within dead matter and simply absorbing nutrients out of those. A great many of them, however, are parasitic. But finally, the third way of feeding that is frequently seen within the protists is probably the most important, and that's photosynthesis. In many ecosystems, especially aquatic ecosystems, protists are the main producers. Okay, again, producers are organisms that produce biomass, mostly through photosynthesis, algae in lakes, but also organisms like dinoflagellates that live within, in this case, the tissues of an animal. Yes, corals, which are shown here, are actually animals. Inside their tissues live these unicellular organisms, which are not plants, but dinoflagellates. These are photosynthetic protists that feed this coral animal in return for the rather impressive defense of its stinging cells, which are capable of killing much larger organisms than the polyp of coral itself. Coral reefs are extremely important for biodiversity. This teamwork between the coral animal and the dinoflagellate makes a habitat which is probably, in terms of diversity, the richest in the world, maybe rivaled only by the tropical rainforests. Other photosynthetic protists live in a remarkable variety of different forms. The huge kelp are actually protists rather than plants. They too support very important ecosystems. Kelp forests are extremely rich and diverse. And again, these organisms that you're seeing here, even though they look very much like plants, are actually a type of protist that is a completely different clade. Interestingly, the photosynthesis that different groups of protists carry out is is based on significantly different photosynthetic compounds. So there are red algae, what are called red algae, brown algae, and green algae, all use different photosynthetic compounds to gather light energy. The diversity in these pigments allows them to specialize on different parts of the light spectrum. And as I mentioned in the lecture on bacteria, that allows more light energy to be harvested from a particular area. Because by using different parts of the light spectrum, these organisms don't compete with one another as much. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of the different groups within the protists. Again, memorization is not one of my important goals for this course. However, I do want you to know the names of some important groups within the protists. There are some groups of protists that I want you to know because they're important in a handful of different ways. The primary way in which protists are probably important to us and to the rest of our planet is as producers, because some of them are ecologically very important. In particular, the plankton in the oceans contains many photosynthetic protists. There are also some protists that live within the digestive tracts of animals and also help them process food. But these are the ciliate protists that you see here, and they're mostly important as producers. One group that you ought to know the name of is the dinoflagellates. Again, these are the organisms that I mentioned earlier live within the tissues of corals. Some of them also live within the tissues of sea anemones, and they absorb or they make food for their hosts in return for protection. They're ecologically important because they account for much of the production in marine ecosystems. In terms of their shape, you can see some of them are quite remarkable. Here are some scanning electron micrographs of these animals. Some of them, interestingly, glow in the dark. If you go on a night dive in one of the areas where these are present, this was actually the first real dive that I ever did after I got dive certified, was to go down into the waters off Costa Rica. And everywhere you move, you basically leave this trail of light behind you as you disturb these photosynthetic or these bioluminescent rather, dinoflagellates. It's very, very beautiful. Another group of producers that you ought to know are the diatoms. These are the ones that live within these very beautiful glassy shells. They're found everywhere, but they are especially important in cold water regions. And again, if you get out your scanning electron micrograph, you can make some really beautiful pictures of these organisms. In fact, even if you're out on land, sometimes you can get pictures of these organisms. This cliff of what looks like white chalk is in fact the skeletons of millions upon millions upon millions of diatoms. As their skeletons accumulate on the sea floor and are compressed together, they form these grand chalky cliffs like the white cliffs of Dover, which you may have heard of. Brown algae are actually not closely related to green algae. This name is somewhat misleading. This is the group that contains the kelp. They are all multicellular, and they look a great deal like plants, so much so that most people mistake them for plants. Although in their details they're quite different and they use a different photosynthetic pigment. Again, these are the basis of the kelp forests, which are extremely important for a number of aquatic food webs and food chains. Red algae, also not the same as green algae, use a still different photosynthetic pigment. They are maybe filaments, but they also grow as a very hard crust, which if you've kept a tropical reef tank, you may be familiar with the crustose red algae. They're very important in the maintenance of coral reefs as well as being a nearshore producer. Here's a close-up of what those look like. And again, very, very different photosynthetic pigments, which allows them to avoid competition with, say, the green algae or the brown algae. There are a number of protists that are important decomposers. One of the most interesting in my eyes is the plasmodial slime molds. These are very peculiar because they can behave, well, essentially, like multicellular organisms. They ooze around in these kind of web-like patterns feeding on decaying vegetation, and they are important for the decomposition of forests. They have this very loose cooperative structure, which is perhaps a harbinger of multicellularity, in that they form teams when they have to in order to reproduce. They also have relatively sophisticated behavior for a fungus. For example, they can be taught to memorize things on an incredibly rudimentary basis, which is something that until a few months ago I didn't even know fungus could do. They're also really beautiful if you happen to like that sort of thing. Finally, two protists that are somewhat infamous. One of them is also a decomposer, like the plasmodial slime molds, but these are the oomycetes. Some of these are unicellular, but again, this is another group that has developed or evolved multicellularity independently of other groups. It looks very much like a fungus, but is in fact a different type of organism. This is the one that is responsible for the Irish potato famine, which, again, a disaster that should not be underestimated, caused a tremendous amount of suffering. A lot of people who now reside in Boston came here because of the Irish potato famine, but still more died as a result. Something like 1 out of every 9 people living in Ireland at the time of the potato famine died because of hunger or some starvation-related disease. And finally, the protist Plasmodium, which I've already talked about a little bit. It's worth noting that this is the most severe chronic health problem in existence today. It is caused by this protist, which has been co-evolving with human beings since we developed agriculture 10 or 20,000 years ago.